Hello, and welcome to Religion in Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. At least since the early part of the 19th century, evangelicalism has been a major player in the story of religion in America. And oftentimes we tend to think of evangelicals as speaking and thinking of one mind and in one voice. My guest today, Dr. Christine Heyrman, reminds us in her new book, Doomed Romance, that evangelicalism, at least in the early part of the 19th century, was conflicted on many issues and had many different takes on some of the moral stances of the time. And this is particularly true, I think, when it comes to the role of women in the church and in the home. Welcome, Dr. Heyrman. I appreciate you coming today to talk about your new book with a great title and cover, Doomed Romance. And I certainly want to get to that book in just a minute, but want to introduce you. You are the Robert W. and Shirley P. Grimble Professor of American History at the University of Delaware. Is that correct?
That is right.
Yeah, and you are an award-winning author and have written some really important books for the study of religion in America. I know my first introduction to your work was with Southern Cross, and then later American Apostles, both which have been important to helping me to understand and translate the many roles of American evangelicalism in the classroom. So I want to get to Doomed Romance, but maybe we could just, I think I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention those two works. Tell me just a little bit about Southern Cross and the kind of impact you think that that's had on the study of religion in America.
Southern Cross tries to explain how the South became the Bible Belt. And this was something that I started wondering about way back with the election of Jimmy Carter and the role that evangelicals, and especially evangelicals in the South, played in supporting Carter's candidacy. And being an historian, of course, I thought, now when did all this get started? When did evangelicalism take root in the South? And so that was sort of the initial inquiry into evangelicalism that got me started. And I was just talking to a doctoral student a few days ago, and he was complaining to me about having to read the book for his qualifying examinations. And I should have asked him, why this is still on people's list. I suspect that it's because it took so long, as it turns out, for evangelicalism to establish itself. And it was a product really of developments during the first half of the 19th century. And so I think that opened up a whole avenue of inquiry. American Apostles is this is a topic that drew my interest after 9/11, and it really came in response to the way so many evangelical leaders were willing to lend their voices to this chorus of Islamophobia. And again, I asked the question, what's the history of this? When do we see the beginning of this engagement of evangelical Protestantism with Islam? And this was what led me initially to the missionary movement of the early 19th century. And I was so interested in and I remain fascinated by the ambivalence of evangelical attitudes toward Islam during the opening decades of the 19th century and the first years of missionaries being in Ottoman Syria, having these encounters with Islam.
Yeah, and what in both those works, and in Doomed Romance too, what really fascinates me is how well you articulate interactions between religious beliefs and ingrained cultural attitudes, and how those two sometimes support one another, sometimes come into conflict with one another, but eventually help to change both the culture and the religion. I think I felt that especially in Southern Cross.
Yes, in fact, it's a great insight into the major theme of Southern Cross.
Mhm.
And unfortunately, the ambivalence toward Islam is not something that seems to have persisted into the 21st century with evangelicals.
Well, your work too highlights, I think, much of what we think we know about evangelicalism is really sort of misguided, or at least I think we tend to project on evangelicalism what we know about it in the latter part of the 20th century, perhaps, and sometimes we confuse fundamentalism with the larger evangelical worldview. But your work, giving us a glimpse into the 19th century, is very enlightening and very interesting about the roots of the movement and how different and would you say today's evangelical movement is substantially different from the evangelicalism you write about in the 19th century?
This is a point that I'm always emphasizing with my students, many of whom have had very secular backgrounds. I teach at a public university, and so many of my students have just no orientation in terms of religion, either present or past. And they think of evangelicalism today as being essentially a conservative political movement. They identify evangelicalism with support for Donald Trump. And of course, Trump's support and the support of conservative evangelicals for conservative republicanism in evangelical ranks is very strong. You can see how they come by this impression. And so they are always amazed to learn that evangelicals in the early republic and in antebellum America are among the most active people in the anti-slavery movement. They are radical abolitionists after 1830. They dominate those ranks. And similarly, evangelicals in the early republic take the lead when it comes to women's education, allowing women opportunities to find meaningful work outside the home. The most famous women in antebellum America, names known in every household, are typically women who have some affiliation with evangelical Protestantism and often as missionaries.
Yeah.
And so this is a very different path from what most of my students think of when they think about evangelicals.
Yeah, so evangelicals in the 19th century were, as you said, at the forefront of some very progressive movements, social movements. And I picked up a little bit of information from your latest book, Doomed Romance, that in many cases, 19th century evangelicals were quite tolerant of say, same-sex marriage, even same-sex relationships, I guess. Which would depart, I think, from the way we normally think of evangelicals and their attitudes towards social issues today.
Yeah, that was one of the more stunning revelations to me as I was doing research for this book, to discover within evangelical ranks this real sympathy for people who are involved in same-sex relationships and acceptance of same-sex relationships, and how prevalent same-sex intimacies were, even among members of the clergy.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I didn't see that one coming around the corner at all. That was a great discovery.
Yeah, it really was a great discovery, and I think one that as I said, I haven't read or discovered in my own research before. So that I appreciate that. subtlety to the story. And maybe that's a good segue to talk about doomed romance. And I'll read the subtitle because I think it's telling. Broken Hearts, Lost Souls, and Sexual Tumult in 19th Century America. So, I mean, it doesn't sound like a book about evangelicalism by the title. And I guess it can be read on so many different levels. There is this wonderful romance story, or story of a love triangle, however you might want to express that, between the protagonist, Martha Parker, Thomas Tenney, and L. Nathan Gridley. And I'm sort of describing it like a novel because in many ways it reads like that. And then there's this kind of wonderful glimpse into 19th century evangelicalism with characters like Lyman Beecher and Charles Grandison Finney. And, you know, we read about these folks, but not in this context. Then we learn about the foreign missions movement of the 19th century. And then I think the part that fascinates me the most is looking at the question of women within the evangelical tradition, and how it seems to me, and we can talk about this, how conflicted in many ways evangelicalism was when it came to the role of women. As progressive as they were in many areas, pushing for women's rights wasn't necessarily one of those areas. But I wanted to read a quote here because I thought this really kind of summed up this issue. Evangelicalism filled them, women, with dreams, but then doomed their full realization. So it was that evangelicalism empowered women in some ways, but then kind of subjugated them when that empowerment came to full flowering. So anyway, that's at least 4 different ways to read that book. So I don't know what you want to start with, but maybe you could just tell us a little bit about the plot of this love triangle here between these forlorn lovers.
You did a brilliant job of, sort of distilling the main message of doomed romance, and just the irony of a movement that on the one hand is really doing more than any other organized group in antebellum America to empower women in every way. And so you're, as an historian, you're kind of expecting to see all sorts of evangelical women taking part in the women's rights movement. You expect to find them at Seneca Falls. You expect to find them in the women's movement thereafter. But in fact, they're a distinct minority within women's rights in antebellum America, and subsequently, it is largely far more liberal Christian women who are taking the lead in women's rights. And so the question, what's so mystifying is, well, what happened? If evangelicalism in the early republic is such an empowering force, why don't you get more women who are joining the political movement to carry this forward? And so that was one of the reasons that I was so curious about this romantic triangle, because it seemed to open up avenues for answering that question. And I came to know very well Martha Parker, who is the young school teacher at the apex of this triangle, and the man that she's initially engaged to, Thomas Tenney, who is he's a school teacher in Hanover, New Hampshire, which is where Dartmouth College is. He's studying for the ministry, and she is all set to wed him when her in-laws introduced her to a fellow named L. Nathan Gridley, who is making the rounds in New England. He's taking up collections for foreign missions, and he himself is headed to the Ottoman Empire to become a missionary. And after much struggle, Martha decides that she's going to break her engagement to Thomas Tenney, and she is going to throw in her lot with L. Nathan Gridley for the chance to have this life of adventure and possibly even celebrity as a missionary wife in the Ottoman Empire. And her older sister is already there as a missionary's wife, so it's kind of in the family. And, and then all of this planning on Martha's part is brought to an abrupt halt when one of Thomas Tenney's friends sends an anonymous letter to the American board that is in charge of all foreign missions and stationing people abroad, and says, really, Martha Parker's past won't bear looking into, and why don't you get to know Thomas Tenney better? And so this sets off this whole investigation, this whole scandal that is just deliciously documented. Queries and letters and historians dream, and people unfold events and talk about their roiling emotions surrounding the scandal.
Yeah, you must have had boxes and boxes of primary materials to work with. The research is impeccable, and I really, the brilliance of this book is to be able to answer some of those initial questions you had through this lens of this story, which is compelling in and of itself. And it's some part of the drama here as the story unfolds is I guess the besmirching of the character of Martha, the insinuations about her behavior. And it's kind of quaint from where we sit, right? That some of the things that eventually disqualified her from the mission field seem so innocent from our perspective. So was that just the times, or I wanted to ask you, do you think there was a coordinated effort to at character assassination here with Martha, that there were some nefarious elements behind this?
Boy, it sure seems that way.
It does.
And that's one of the things that makes this so fascinating, is that it's not just Thomas Tenney and his friends who are willing to dish the dirt about Martha, but they get a very powerful advocate in the then president of Dartmouth College, a fellow by the name of Bennett Tyler, who conveniently happens to sit on the American board for foreign missions. And he takes it upon himself to not only to foster this scandal, but to personally threaten Martha. And he goes to see her, and he tells her that for her to put aside Thomas Tenney and to break their engagement and marry another man, that in doing this she will be committing adultery. And the question is, what's going on here? Wouldn't you think running Dartmouth would give Bennett Tyler enough to do without sort of shaking down unsuspecting females in his neck of the woods? And, it turns out that Martha's troubles correspond with a rising tide of assertiveness on the part of women in New England's churches. You mentioned Charles Finney, the great revivalist, and Finney is conducting these blood and thunder revivals, and he is encouraging women to get up and not to preach, but to exhort, to tell people that they should be behaving themselves, give little moral speeches, and to name names, and to strong arm their husbands into the church. And of course, this is the same time when you have women increasingly being educated in institutions like female seminaries that are founded by evangelicals. They are increasingly playing a big role in all sorts of reform organizations. And so women are, through largely progressive evangelical auspices, entering the public sphere in a way that they have not before. And Bennett Tyler, the president of Dartmouth College, sees Martha Parker as one of these troublesome women, one of these women who, lusts to become a missionary and to win renown, and is, emblematic of all these other gals who are just stepping out of their place. And he's going to do what he can to do this.
So is it fair to say something like Martha was a victim of men of privilege who were protecting that privilege and who were threatened by this kind of sudden rise of women exerting themselves in the public sphere?
Yeah, no, I mean, you put that very well. And the delicious irony is that it is women who are availing themselves of the opportunities offered by evangelicals, by progressive evangelicals. And so in a sense, people like Bennett Tyler and Thomas Tenney feel that they have to reclaim their own movement, that evangelicals have gotten squishy on women, and these gals have to be put back in their place.
Well, and the way your book ends suggests to me that ultimately these forces won, right? And evangelical women were silenced. They were, as you put it, they were led right up to the brink of making contributions, and then were silenced by men like Tenney and Tyler.
Yeah, I mean, boy, you would get an A+ if there were an exam on.
Oh, we better not go there.
No, I appreciate such a close reading. But the bottom line is that we don't find women, evangelical women, in any numbers in the ranks of early feminists, because women within the evangelical movement have been so thoroughly cowed into submission by people like Bennett Tyler. They have been made to understand that there is a price to be paid if they expect education, if they expect a role in activism, that they have to maintain, they have to keep themselves within compass, within bounds.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question about your role as historian here. A couple of times in the book, I felt like you were stepping back just a little bit, and at one point you even said something like the hazard of historical writing, or the hazard of being an historian, is falling to the temptation of projecting one's own place in history onto the lives of the people you're writing about. And you remind the reader a couple of times about the importance of maintaining historical context. Can you say just a little bit about that, perhaps?
Yeah, and I think especially with a story like Doomed Romance. I mean, who among us has not been part of a romantic triangle at some time in our gay youth, or commented on a romantic triangle, advised a friend who's involved in I mean, there's so much about this story that is just so familiar. And and you really get into the kind of these fundamental questions in the history of emotion. Do people in the past, even the not so distant past of 200 years ago, do they feel things the way that we do today? Do they experience things the way that we do today? And I will mention just one thing that really surprised me, and that I didn't see coming. When Martha decides that she's going to get engaged in the first place to Thomas Tenney, who is not a prepossessing guy. You know, I mean, if I were looking for a date, he would be way down on my list. And Martha felt that way about him at first, as did her older sisters, you know, like, oh, this guy is a creep, you know, you don't want anything to do with him. And then all of a sudden, she is not just entertaining his suit, but really inviting it. And it became clear to me that she was doing this in part for reasons related to religion. Martha belongs to this very pious family. Everybody belongs to the local church. But for Martha, she is the spiritual runt of the Parker litter, and someone who desperately wants religious assurance, but feels like it's beyond her grasp. And Thomas Tenney, you know, you could say all kinds of bad things about him, but the one good thing you can say is that he is somebody who is, by his own self-presentation, a spiritual prodigy. He's this very self-assured guy. He thinks he's got heaven knocked, you know, that the door is open. And it just amazed me the extent to which religion was part of her romantic calculus. That, you know, she set aside all of her other reservations about him and those of her sisters because he provided her with this essential confidence in her own spirituality.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a remarkable story, Dr. Heyrman. I you know, you really make history come alive. You're a great storyteller, and I would tell people who think that reading history is boring that they should pick up your books.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a brilliant book, Doomed Romance, and I appreciate you taking the time today to share with us about the process of writing history. I feel like we could talk about that for a couple of hours, but also sharing this wonderful story of Martha. I'm not going to spoil the plot, so I'm not going to tell too much about how it ends, but we'll just leave it at that, and maybe people will pick this book up and read this wonderful story. But thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, that's it for Religion in Life this week. I hope you'll join us next week on AppTV as we continue to explore the role of religion and the relationship of religion, culture, and society. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.